In this video, I would like to talk about the reason why the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, decided to chase behind the Israelites after he initially decided to give them their freedom. In order to look at that situation, we have to kind of go back to where it all started, and that is with Jacob. Jacob had 12 sons and one daughter. One of his sons' name was Joseph. Joseph was Jacob's favorite son, and that kind of made his other brothers dislike him to the point they hated him and wanted to kill him. But instead of killing him, they sold him into slave. So he was sold into slave and ended up in Egypt. While ended up in Egypt, he was a slave of Potiphar. Because God was still with Joseph, even though he was a slave, he still was very prosperous in Potiphar's house. So Potiphar put him over all the other slaves and put him over his whole household. And so with Joseph being there, Potiphar's wife wanted to sleep with him. Because of Joseph's love for God and his respect for Potiphar, he never did. She was always trying to seduce him. And then one day, no one was in the house but them two. So she tried to seduce him. He ran from her to the point that he left his clothes behind. She ripped his clothes off. So she screamed that he basically tried to seduce her, more or less that he tried to rape her. So Joseph ended up being thrown into prison for that reason. While in prison, he was still prosperous because God was still with him. And then he ended up being over the prison. While in that position over the prison, there was two people that used to work for the Pharaoh, and that was the chief baker and the chief butler. While in prison, they had a dream. Joseph was able to interpret the dream. He told the chief butler, don't worry about anything, you're going to be put back in your same position. And then he told the chief baker, unfortunately, you're going to die, you're going to be hung. So both dreams came to fruition. The butler was put back in his position in the Pharaoh's house. And before he left, Joseph was like, remember me, I shouldn't be here, speak to the Pharaoh on my behalf. And so the chief butler was like, okay, I will look out for you. Once he got back in his position, got all about Joseph. So one day the Pharaoh had a dream that everybody that was in his court should have been able to interpret the dream, but they wasn't. They didn't know what it meant. So that's when the chief butler remembered Joseph and say, okay, there's an Israelite that's in prison. He interpreted my dream as well as the chief baker's dream. They both came, true. So the Pharaoh told them to bring Joseph to him. He told Joseph his dream about the fatted cow and the skinny cows. Joseph was able to interpret the dream and let the Pharaoh know that there's going to be 7 years of harvest where everything, you're going to have a lot of good, 7 good years. And then there's going to be 7 years of famine. So he explained to the Pharaoh that in order to survive those 7 years of famine, we have to store up grain in those 7 good years. So the Pharaoh put Joseph in charge. So now Joseph still is having favor from God. The only person higher than Joseph in the whole kingdom of Egypt is the Pharaoh himself. So those 7 good years, Joseph went ahead throughout the cities, different cities, storing up wheat and grain for those. So when the 7 hard years come, 7 years of famine, they will still have wheat to be able to eat and supply to the people. So during the 7 years of famine, everyone was coming to Egypt to buy grain because there was food nowhere. During that time, Joseph's family came, and you kind of know that story where his brothers realized that he, who Joseph was. They kind of made up, they made up with each other. And so Joseph ended up introducing the Pharaoh to his family. the Pharaoh's like, all right, you can bring them with you and they can live in Egypt. And so they went ahead and moved. It was about 70 of them at the time. So everyone came and they settled in Egypt. So now all of Joseph's family is in Egypt. And so when you fast forward to Exodus, you see that a new king, a new Pharaoh arises and don't remember Joseph because so many years has passed since that situation with the famine. And so now that the new king is there, he's looking at the Israelites and he's seeing that there are so many of them. They're so powerful. They're more Israelites than the Egyptian. They're more powerful than the Egyptian. So they seeing them as their enemies, and they're saying that they can overtake us, or they can either get with our enemies and overtake us that way. So what the new king, the new Pharaoh, decided to do was to put slave masters over them and turn them into slaves. And he had them building, different cities, different things, and he worked them to the, he worked them very hard, and he was very oppressive over them. But during the time of him being oppressive over them, their numbers did not dwindle. Their numbers actually increased, so it actually became more of them. That made him hate them even more. That made him become more oppressive over them. So fast forward again to Moses. And we know that, Moses' mother put him in the Nile. He ended up being raised by the Pharaoh. He ended up killing an Egyptian and he ran. And that's when God came to him in a burning bush to send him back, him and his brother Aaron, to send them back to Egypt so they can free the Israelites from the slavery. So, during that course of time, the Pharaoh heart was very hard and he did not want to let them go. And so there was 10 plagues that happened. And based on those plagues, Moses told him that, each time you don't let the people go, there's going to be another plague. So once they got to the 10th plague, the Pharaoh's like, go worship your God, leave, because if not, everyone here would end up dying. So that's what they did. They ended up taking their cattle and everything like that, all the livestock, and they left. And Moses told them before they leave, go to the Egyptians and ask them for gold, silver, and clothing. So they did that. They got the gold, the silver, and clothing. And so they left with everything. So it was I think it's around like 6,000 of them at this time. And that's just counting the men and not counting the women and the children. So they all left out of Egypt. And so the Pharaoh kind of thought about it and had a change of mind. And his heart was hardened against them again. And he was like, we made a mistake. We shouldn't have let them go. So he got his best soldiers, his best chariots. They mounted up and started chasing the Israelites down to get them back and put them back into slavery, because they was like, we have no one to serve us. And then they don't have anything, because the Israelites took all the gold and took all the silver and clothing and everything. So he's chasing them down. As we know, once Moses get to the Red Sea, God parts the Red Sea for all the Israelites to cross. But then once the Egyptian got to the point of crossing the Red Sea, they ended up being drowned. So basically the reason why the soldiers chased behind the Israelites is because they didn't have any more gold, silver, clothing, cattle, livestock. They didn't have anything. They didn't have any slaves or anything. Excuse me. All the wealth of the Egyptian of Egypt left with the Israelites. So it may seem like, if you look at the whole story, so that's why I want to go back to Joseph. If you look at the whole story, it may look as if the Israelites took what initially belongs to the Egyptian. But if you look at the story, you will see that their wealth came from God. The Israelites was God's chosen people. God put Joseph in a position to be able to not only save his people, but also to save the Egyptians. Because if Joseph was never sold into slavery, he would have never been able to interpret the Pharaoh's dream, and he would never been able to store up those the weeks for the 7 years of famine. That would have never happened. But because God was with Joseph, because God gave Joseph the ability to interpret the dreams, all the wealth that Egypt had came from God. It did not come from the works of the Egyptians alone. It came from God putting Joseph in a position to be able to build the wealth for the Egyptians. And so when they left, God just basically took his wealth and sent it out with his people. The wealth that he put into Egypt, God took it out and sent it with his people when they left out of Egypt. And so when you look at these stories in the Bible, a lot of times as Christians, we kind of can get lost in the fact that how can it relate to us in today's time? Is it an old book? Is it God's word is a living word. God's word never dies. When you look at Ecclesiastes 1:9, it's basically stating there's nothing new in this world. So we're just descendants of these generations that came before us. We're their descendants. We're basically going through the same things they went to, but on a more different level. We're now modernized, so we have a different way of thinking, a different way of seeing, but the behaviors are the same. The consequences are the same. The actions are the same. Because when you compare that to what's going on today in this time now, when you look at how instead of the Egyptians looking at the Israelites as allies, they automatically looked at them as enemies. Instead of saying, hey, if our enemies come to attack us, we have the Israelites with us and they can help us defend ourselves, because they have been living in our land all these years and never done anything to us. We have been commingling, living as neighbors, so there would be no reasons to doubt their loyalty to us or doubt their love for us or doubt anything about them and not make them into slaves. But because of their hatred and seeing them as enemies instead of allies, they turned them into slaves. When you look at what's going on in Africa and how, even though, let me go back. So, when they let them go and gave them their freedom, they're chasing them down to get them back and make them back into slaves instead of allowing them to take what belongs to them and go about their business. They chasing them down to get what they feel belongs to them and also get them back as slaves. So when you look at what's going on in Africa, when all these countries, these French countries, and all these coups, they're saying we don't want to have you over us anymore. We want to be free to decide our destination. We want to be able to use our resources to build our country up, to give a better life to our people, to our kids. So when they have kids, they don't have to grow up in the dark. They can have lights. They can have basic needs and necessity. All that can be met if we have a chance to develop our own country. French don't want to listen. French don't want to let them go. They want to stay there. And everything that France have isn't because of the works of France. It's because of what they took from Africa that did not belong to them. So now they don't want to let them go to live their own life, to have their own destiny, because they still want to hold on to them, because they don't see them as allies. Hey, let me go ahead and work with them and buy what I need from them, just like I buy what I need from every other country. Let me show them the same respect. They see them as their enemies, so they want to oppress them. The same thing when the slaves came from Africa to America. Once our freedom was given to us, as far as on paper, our freedom was never given to us, because if you look at everything that the blacks went through in America, as far as when they had their own, when they built their own community, when they had their own wealth, when they said, okay, we're separate but we're equal, we're not going to worry about what y'all are doing over there, we're going to mind our business. They still wasn't satisfied with that, to the point that they burnt those cities down, they burnt those towns down. They kept finding ways to take their wealth, something that did not belong to them. They found their way to take it, to build their own wealth, and feel that they're more superior, instead of saying these people are our allies, we can work with them, we can respect them, we can all, benefit from one another. Instead of thinking like that, no, they still see us as suspicious, they still see us as enemies, they still see us as people that they need to oppress in order for them to be superior, in order for them to have, wealth and different things like that. And so when you look at the story, the one of the lessons you can learn from the story is your hatred for someone else can be your downfall. Your hatred from someone else can be the reason why you end up dying. Because if you think about it, if they, like I said, if they never seen the Egyptians as their enemies and their allies, they would have continued to live their life. They would continue to, everything that was going on would have continued to go on. But once they made that fatal mistake of seeing them as their enemies, when all the wealth left, they chased behind them to the point of destroying themselves. So now Egypt had no Pharaoh, because the Pharaoh died at the Red Sea. His son died because of the plague. Every firstborn in the household was going to die. His son died, so they have nobody coming up behind him. And then, all the wealth end up leaving. So they can't even go buy more slaves. They can't buy things. So all this stemmed from seeing a group of people and then hating that group of people to the point that you want to control them. And it ended up killing you in the long run, and end up destroying your kingdom at the same time. So so basically that's all I wanted to say, and I will leave the scriptures in the description box. Peace.